impact that African Americans have had in this great nation. I'm so excited that God has brought him home to a place where we can say that there's no segregation in heaven, where he'll meet William Decker Bonner, Rachel Clark, and others that he has fought for in this nation to put Christ on display so that he can fight against discrimination in this nation.
Pastor Loudon,
I just want to thank everyone out there.
Yeah, we're looking at images of you with the Carters right now as you thank the American people who are watching. And I'll let you finish that sentiment, and I'll only tack on a bit of a question to it, though, if I could, Pastor, which is, as you know, we are in very divided times in this country, and there's no sort of one moment that will solve that, but perhaps moments like the one that we're witnessing here today, and just being reminded of what the former president stood for, particularly in the post-presidency. And I've been moved by the news reports, the articles that I've read about this sort of long road home back through Washington before he goes back home again. The kinds of people who've lined the route, Democrats and Republicans who say, you know, I wouldn't vote for a Democrat, but I do like what he stood for in the end. And the way that he was even more so after the presidency able to bring Americans together. There can be a lot learned from that, Pastor.
As I've traveled around the country fighting for criminal justice reform, I've had Republicans come up to me and whisper, how's the president doing? I've had independents come up to me and say, how's the president doing? Driving through Southwest Georgia, getting to the place where we are celebrating his life, there was folks in rural communities that we know were red communities lined the streets with their flags and saluting the casket as it went by. You know, we have to get to the point in our nation where we understand that rural, inner city communities, whether it's high income or low income, we all want to believe, as President Carter put in his speech in 1979, a crisis in confidence, that we have confidence in our nation, that no matter how many times we have elections, that we'll come together for the greater good. Because we swear in our servant leaders who put their left hand on the Bible and raise their right hand to make a commitment to Old Glory. And we use faith and hope as the guardrails of our democracy so that we can stand and be that shining light on the hill. That's what President Carter was all about. He wanted to make sure that we had a nation that would recognize those who are downtrodden, those who may need water, clean water overseas in Africa. He really gave us his best. I can say now that we can answer that question that Admiral Rickover asked him, why you didn't give your best. We can tell him today that President Jimmy Carter gave America and the world his best.
Very moving. Pastor Tony Loudon, who is traveling with the motorcade right now as you're watching it live on the left-hand side of your screen there. This is ABC News Live coverage as a country celebrates a former president, the 39th president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, making his final trip into Washington, D.C. He will stop at the U.S. Navy Memorial. And as we talked about here this afternoon, the former president was extraordinarily proud of his early days in the U.S. Navy, his time spent there studying nuclear energy as well before deciding to move back home to Plains, Georgia, to work with the family farm, the peanut farm, and then dive into politics. And as I mentioned earlier in our coverage, first state senator, then he tried for governor, did not win the first time, eventually was successful. And when he eventually had obviously shared the news with Rosalynn, had worked so closely with Rosalynn Carter all of those years, when they broke the news to the rest of the family, Lillian, his mother, his outspoken mother, said, "President of what you want to be?" And he was off. He began his campaign for the presidency in a time in America when the people of this country were hungry for change, and we've seen that so many times in modern politics, different eras in this country. That particular era, obviously, following the Vietnam War, following Watergate, and Jimmy Carter sensed that there might be room for a Democrat from the South, for an outsider, for somebody who was not going to show up and deliver politics as usual. And how many times have we heard that? But for what it's worth, he was not comfortable with the glad-handing nature sort of Washington. And some say that probably hurt him politically as he tried to pass so many policies and proposals that he had. Some said that he bit off more than he could chew, and then he certainly was handed crises that he had to address. The Iran hostage crisis, the final year of his presidency, the energy crisis, inflation, which he was elected on to try to fix the economy, and then was saddled with a very difficult economy during his 4 years as well. Ronald Reagan winning in 1980, both on the economy, obviously, as a major issue, and bringing the Americans home, which, as you know, Jimmy Carter learned of in the final hours of his presidency. It wasn't until actually after the inauguration that those Americans actually came home. And Martha Raddatz, you've traveled to Iran, so have I. So you've been there so often. You've visited what was once the U.S. Embassy. And those final days of the presidency would go on to haunt Jimmy Carter for many, many years. He spoke in many of his writings about looking at himself in the mirror in those final hours of the presidency, wondering, have I really aged this much, or am I simply exhausted, given I have not slept? That he was determined to get those hostages freed in the end.
He certainly was, David. And during those years, those 444 days that the 53 American hostages were held, you could see it on Jimmy Carter's face. You could see the pain. You could see how much attention he was paying to that. And then, of course, the tragic loss of life of 8 service members who were trying to rescue those hostages, that failed rescue attempt. When you go to that embassy today, which they call the den of spies, and walk through that embassy, it's left exactly as it was when the hostages were finally freed. And you can just feel that history. You can feel Jimmy Carter's history, the pain of that. For many, many years, they had the rotor of Desert One, of the helicopter that crashed into a transport plane on top of that embassy as a symbol of loss. During the nuclear agreement period, the joint nuclear agreement period, they took it down. The Iranians took it down and they put it in the back. And I could see it in the back. And I thought that was so symbolic as well. But that was something that pained Jimmy Carter till the end. I assume he thought about it a lot still. What could I have done differently? What did I do wrong? He obviously went on. He had his faith, as you've talked so eloquently about in the last hour or so. But that was something that stayed with Jimmy Carter. He didn't think about it in political terms. He didn't think, oh, darn, I lost because of that. He thought of that in human terms. And there you see, of course, those horses and that caisson waiting to transfer Jimmy Carter's remains into that caisson, which will be an incredibly moving point. And that, again, as you said, David, is at that Navy memorial that he authorized to be built because the Navy meant so much to him.
He did. He chose the United States Navy Memorial as the site of transfer when planning his funeral procession through Washington. Martha Raddatz, thank you for being here this afternoon, and we'll come back to you again shortly. You're looking at the motorcade as it travels into Washington and preparations at the U.S. Navy Memorial for that transfer, that deeply moving moment. Mark Updegrove, a presidential historian, just to sort of finish the point on Iran, because so many Americans of a certain age will remember when, our network news anchors would each night begin their newscasts with the count. How many days have the hostages been held in Iran?
You're absolutely right, David. Day 21, day 59, day 352. It went on and on and on, and had a drip effect on the Carter administration. But it also bears mentioning that while it really crippled the Carter presidency, Carter was determined to see to the release of those 52 hostages, and he did. The last 3 days of his presidency, he was holed up in the Oval Office. He got no sleep. Occasionally, he would nap for an hour or two on the couch in the Oval Office, but he was there to ensure their release, and indeed, they were released on his the last day of his presidency. A last thumb in his eye. The Iranians released the hostages. They left Iranian airspace just after Ronald Reagan took the presidency. But Jimmy Carter, on what may have been the most humiliating day of his life, relinquishing the presidency to Ronald Reagan after failing to be reelected, talked about that as the happiest day of his life because those 52 Americans were released, David.
Isn't that extraordinary, Mary Jordan? It's just a moment in history, certainly, that we all do remember. But to know that deeply personal moment, he was giving up the presidency. But as Mark points out, it was his most sort of fulfilled moment of the presidency, too, is that he was able to get those Americans freed in the very, very end. And I've read in going back that he'd reached out to the president-elect Ronald Reagan, who did not take the call that morning to inform him that I've learned that the hostages will be released. And of course, we know the timing of it. It didn't officially happen until the new president was sworn in. But to think he was giving up the presidency, he had been defeated by Ronald Reagan, who ran a very smart and difficult campaign to compete with, given the economy and what was playing out in Iran. And in fact, he talked about making America great again back in leading up to the 1980 election. But to think that personally, in those very quiet moments in the final hours of the presidency for Jimmy Carter, Mary, he was simply grateful that the hostages would come home.
When he was 94, I talked at length about this with him. And he said, you know, I think in hindsight, I was too consumed. I was paralyzed. All I could think of were each of those hostages, each of their families. It was hard to sleep. And, you know, I don't think I could have done anything differently, but, you know, it was very interesting as he grew older. And, you know, many books have been written about what he had done. And then he said, a lot of people come down here, you know, I'm struck, from Washington to talk to me about how to handle pressure like this. Like when you're in the presidency or you're running a big Senate committee. I mean, the pilgrimage down to Jimmy Carter is amazing. I was there when Bill Clinton came not too long ago. And I said to former President Clinton, what did you talk about with Jimmy? And he said, well, you know, I was in the presidency. We didn't really talk about those stressful things like the hostages. We talk about marriage. and I said to Jimmy, you know, there's something to be said for sticking. But whether it was a stressful thing like how to handle a world crisis, hostages, a war, or marriage, Nancy Pelosi was down there. Pete Buttigieg was down there. There has been a whole pilgrimage making this motorcade the opposite way. And now today his body is coming back. But over the last several years, quietly, an enormous number of well-known people in Washington came down to Plains, Georgia, where this motorcade started, to just say either thank you or to ask some advice.
To ask advice from someone who had lived many, many decades post the presidency. And as we're watching the motorcade get closer to the U.S. Navy Memorial in Washington, we think about that pilgrimage in reverse direction, as Mary Jordan says, of so many leaders and political operatives who made that trip to Plains, Georgia, and President Biden, who did so in a very public manner with First Lady Jill Biden. They were determined as sitting president and sitting First Lady to travel home to Plains, Georgia, Jimmy Carter's home, and Rosalind Carter, to honor them in a very public way and to acknowledge their service in all these decades since the presidency. Our chief Washington correspondent, again, Jonathan Karl, has been with us all afternoon here. And John, the power of this moment here as he approaches the U.S. Navy Memorial.
Absolutely. And hearing of the pilgrimage down to Plains and all of those leaders who came to pay their respects and to have one last conversation with Jimmy Carter and to see this now play out. He was the ultimate outsider. And frankly, David, he remained the ultimate outsider for many years after he left the presidency. In fact, you mentioned Joe Biden, the president and First Lady Jill Biden going down to visit him in Plains. That was actually the first time a sitting president had gone down to see Jimmy Carter in all those years. He didn't have particularly close relationships with any of his successors until Joe Biden. He had a very close relationship with his predecessor, interestingly, Gerald Ford, but he was not part of the of the former president's club. He went in an entirely different direction, which was fitting with how he came to Washington in the first place. There's a great quote from Jimmy Carter where, during the campaign, he said, "I've been accused of being an outsider. I plead guilty. Unfortunately, the vast majority of Americans are outsiders as well. And they have not been served by the shifting group of insiders that take over from one party or another takes over." He was a breath of fresh air from the outside, somebody with really no Washington experience, somebody who his big first promise was a very simple one: "I will never lie to you. I will never lie to you."
John Carl with us here as well. Proud of being an outsider, Jimmy Carter was, and the American people do like an outsider. They then expect you to operate like an insider and fix things the moment you get there, which is the real challenge facing so many of the leaders of our time. Martha Raddatz, every president gets to decide whether to have a procession like this one, and Jimmy Carter, in rare form, in this moment, said, "This is what I would like."
He specifically wanted this hearse to stop in front of the Navy Memorial. Look at all those midshipmen lined up. Look at all those naval officers lined up to honor President Carter. It is a beautiful spot there in Washington. I know you have been there as well, David, the one he authorized to be built in honor of the Navy, in honor of those who had served in the Navy all those years. I know the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, is there. He told me this morning that he would be there by 1:30 and that it was such an honor and a blessing to get to know President Carter during his time as Secretary of the Navy. He also told me that on his 100th birthday, on Jimmy Carter's 100th birthday, the Secretary of the Navy thought, "What do you do for Jimmy Carter?" And he had an F-18 flyover for President Carter. President Carter stood there with his children, his grandchildren, and watched those grand airplanes fly above him, and to remember his own Navy service. He actually learned how to fly a plane while in the Navy with supervision, they say, but his life was spent on ships and in submarines during his time in the Navy, David.
Martha, thank you. And let's listen here in Washington. Again, the former president requesting this. And we've talked often here this afternoon about so much of the fanfare that he sort of passed over when he was actually president, saying it's not necessary. You don't have to do that. Call me Jimmy, even during his inauguration. But this was an honor that he was hoping he would receive. This is the U.S. Army's 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard. The lead horses here, Rocket and Burns. Members of the U.S. Navy lined up, prepared to pay their respects to the former president, the 39th president, who, as Martha Raddatz has so eloquently put here this afternoon, was so deeply shaped by and honored by his service to his country. The former president chose the U.S. Navy Memorial as the site of this transfer when planning his own funeral. Martha mentioned this, but he authorized the building, the United States Navy Memorial Plaza, the Visitor Center. That's, of course, on Pennsylvania Avenue for anyone who's made the trip to Washington, D.C. Quite remarkable that the eyes are of the nation fixed on Pennsylvania Avenue. They will be again in just a few days' time for the transfer of power. And these are one of those moments meant to bring the country together, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, and sort of a reminder of the respect we have for presidency, our institutions. It comes just hours after the certification of the next president of the United States. You can see flags there at half staff as they are across the nation to honor the 39th president, 100 years old. And as Steve Osunsami reported earlier here in talking with the former president's grandson, that in recent days, while still in hospice, he started to indicate to his close loved ones that it was time to go see Rosalind.
That's right, David. He talked about wanting to see his Rose. She died in November of 2023. There were many of us who knew and the family well and knew his relationship with his wife, how important she was to him, who worried that when that happened, that his demise might soon follow. But he pressed on. We talk a lot about the strength of this man, and how much he persevered, the long life he lived. When I talked with both of them in that final interview, they told me that they found small joys in just reading the Bible together at night. That was something that they tried to do every night, that they tried to do something every day, and that's how they made their relationship last. And so when she passed, there were so many of us who were watching very carefully. As you remember, David, at her funeral, he was still in hospice care in Plains, Georgia, about 3 hours south of Atlanta, but he was determined to be there to say goodbye here in Atlanta at her funeral services in front of heads of states from around the world. As you know, he famously had a new suit made for him because the suit that he had didn't fit. So tailors came in and made a new suit for him so that he could say goodbye to his Rose. And here they are now together again.
Determined to be there to pay his respects to Rosalind Carter. And Steve, it was you who asked that question the final time. What was the secret to their long and deep, deep bond? And we'll hear more about that in the backside. Let's listen.
Right shoulder, move. Guard, ready, up.
Martha Raddatz, when you look at the young faces of the midshipmen of the Naval Academy who will flank the memorial here, their faces to the side, you have to think that the former president would have been so proud to have the next generation of the Navy there for him.
He certainly would, David. And you look at that group of midshipmen and young officers and enlisted, and it makes me think of Wesley Brown. He was the 6th Black midshipman at the Naval Academy, but the first to graduate. And he gave some credit to that to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter befriended him. He helped him face the challenges of life at the Naval Academy. Wesley Brown has now passed away several years ago. But again, I heard today talking to several people how much Jimmy Carter meant to him because he truly cared. He truly helped him. And those were very, very difficult days for Black midshipmen. But look at those faces today. That is a diverse Navy, a diverse military. Jimmy Carter very proud of that.
A very cold and raw and yet sunny day in the nation's capital. We're about to witness the casket being removed from the hearse. Ceremonial troops will then present arms and render honors to the family. And then the former president will be brought to the Capitol. Much of this, in addition to the honors by the U.S. Navy, which so deeply moved the former president as he was planning the funeral that they would be willing to do this for him, given his early years in the Navy. But the rest of this procession from here on out is meant to sort of remind the country, if you will, of what they did as the family, as a family arriving in Washington, getting out of the car on Pennsylvania Avenue and waving to those who had lined the route, which at the time had not been done before. There you see those images today. We'll talk with members of the family in a moment as the procession continues. But we're going to listen even more closely here as the honors play out at the U.S. Navy Memorial. You can see the hearse arriving with the former president, Jimmy Carter. The U.S. Navy band has assembled. Family members will also disembark and will gather to watch their father and grandfather be honored before the nation today. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren. This was a building that Jimmy Carter helped commission, as you know, to honor the U.S. Navy. And as so many of our contributors have pointed out here this afternoon, Jimmy Carter, when he was president, often did not require them to perform to the chief. But this was an honor that he did ask for, and one that he earned given his service to the country, certainly. He and the First Lady Rosalind Carter spoke often about how proud they were of those early years in the U.S. Navy. And as Martha pointed out earlier, it wasn't easy for Rosalind Carter either, as they began their family as well. But they were moved and shaped by those times. Mary, we're looking at members of the Carter family. His oldest son, Jack, there arriving with other members of the family. You can see the children and the grandchildren there.
Yes, he has 3 sons in their 70s and Amy, who's in her 50s.